Hi there. Um, I'm just getting over a cold, so my voice is a little bit rough on this. We previously reviewed Spencer Lee's magnificent book on the Beatles in Hamburg, which, to my mind, is the best, just specifically on that topic. But today I'm going to look at some other books which cover that territory as well. And that there's a debate about the relative importance of Hamburg and Liverpool to the story of the Beatles. And in this review, I'll discuss that. I mean, one point is that the Beatles played in Hamburg before they played the Cavern. Now, they did play the Cavern as the Quarrymen and were told to cut out the bloody rock and roll. But as the Beatles, they hadn't played there until they had already done their first stint in Hamburg. So there is that, and there's other considerations. Um, Really, before Hamburg, the Beatles were rather mediocre, to be honest, by all accounts. Um, their professionalism hadn't developed. They had energy and they had ambition, but they didn't have the things to back it up at that stage. And Hamburg, in many ways, did give them that. So, what I would say is the following things they got from Hamburg. Firstly, they became what's usually described in modern terms as a tight musical group. They learned how to play together and they um, learned instinctively what each other was going to do and how each other played. And everything tightened up. And by the end of the first stint in Hamburg, their level of professionalism as musicians and as a band, as a whole, as a unit, had progressed immeasurably. Secondly, and I think I mentioned this on the previous review, their set list expanded. They had made the decision, and it was a rather interesting decision and a very clever decision that even though they were playing these tremendously long hours at the Indra and then the Kaiserkeller, that they wouldn't repeat a song. Now, the chances of somebody being there for the entire set and hearing this repeat was slim, but they still thought it might happen. So they wouldn't repeat a song. And this required them to look far afield to broaden out their set list. And this included standards and tunes from musicals, um, almost schoolboy songs that they'd learned, uh, and they worked them into their act. And this stood them in good stead because they could slow everything down in the early hours and play appropriately. And it also stood them in good stead later when they came to write their own music. They had this tremendous broad experience of different types of music, different genres, different styles, different tempos to draw upon. Third, they were exhorted by Bruno Koschmider to Max Schau, make a show, entertain the audience. And they developed this. They became entertainers. This was one of the things that was noticed about them. It's one of the things that Brian Epstein noticed about them when they first played. Their interaction with the audience. Um, Many bands, even today, have an invisible wall between them and the audience, and the Beatles didn't. And Paul would quite often be the link man. He'd introduce the numbers, and um, he would dedicate songs to members to the fans in the audience that he'd spoken to. You can hear this on the Star Club tapes later on. While John would be cavorting in the back, gurning, marching up and down, uh, and just be, John was influenced by the Goons, and he would do that kind of humor, some of which later kind of you would see in Monty Python, that kind of physical humor. And they would entertain the audience. They had their own little in jokes and their own little things they did. Sometimes they were outrageous, without a doubt, but they became entertainers. And finally, according to Max Lewison, when they returned from the first stint, they were the most experienced rock and roll band in the world. Now, that sounds like um, a fantastic statement, and it brought me up when I first read it. And I thought about it, and he lays out the evidence, and it was true. And if you take Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours of practice, um, this was evidence of that. In fact, I think in Malcolm Gladwell's books, he does cite that Beatles experience in Hamburg. Um, so uh, they were just the most experienced rock and roll band in the world when they came back. They were used to doing it. They were totally professional at what they were doing. Before Hamburg, they were desperate for bookings. The bookings were few and far between. They were regulars at the Jacaranda, which was a small cellar, and sometimes in the Casbah, which they basically burnt the boats really before we went to Hamburg, and then just odd um, uh, venues here and there. After Hamburg, they were the top paid band in Liverpool, and they were always top of the bill. So that was the difference. And also, I think their influence of Hamburg was more on the Beatles than anyone else because they had more work to do. Some of the other bands had already reached their level, the Beatles hadn't, and it was the accelerator, it was the kind of afterburner that launched them, and their potential was limitless, as we've seen. So, the books I want to discuss about this are these ones. Firstly, The Beatles in Hamburg by Ian Inglis. And he sets the scene with the minibus trip. Alan Williams, his wife, his brother-in-law, the Beatles. He doesn't mention there was someone else, a German. Um, and off they go, and that's the start of the Hamburg story. Um, one of the things he does, uh, or one of the things he sets straight is to differentiate between fact and fiction. He says it's important to understand the Hamburg story, but it's also important to separate the myths and legends, which have grown up over time. So, and he does that in this book very, very well. And, we can applaud him for that, for putting a lot of the records straight. A point I'd make is in many cases, the Beatles themselves are not the most reliable historians. Um, Now, memory, this was all when they were kids, really, and memories fade and change, etc. And I think they told the story in some early interviews, and then the memories later on were of that story they told rather than of the actual events. And also, the Beatles, and particularly John, always seemed to be future looking. They didn't really like the past. They didn't like to look back. They left things behind them pretty rapidly, and Hamburg was one of those things. Um, I think towards the end uh, of with the Star Club stints, they resented being there. It was contractual obligations, and they wanted to be elsewhere. And I think that coloured the whole memory of Hamburg. and sometimes some of the things that they remember are variants with established fact. So that is a point I'd say. One of the things that Ian Inglis does is he puts the full chronology, and I'll go through it. 17th of August to 3rd of October 1960, the Indra Club. 4th of October to 30th of November, Kaiserkeller. They then returned to Liverpool. 1st of April to 1st of July 61, the top 10. Then 62, 13th of April to 31st of May, the Star Club. That's when they opened the Star Club. Then they made two more visits, 1st of November till 14th of 62, and then they came home, then went back quickly, 18th of December to 31st of December, 62, the Star Club. So that was the 5 trips that they made, really. 5 separate trips that they made. And another thing that Ian Inglis does is he talks about people who've got axes to grind about the Beatles and who try to use the Beatles story to make a point. It is now more than 50 years since the Beatles made their first trip to Hamburg. As the public knowledge of the story has gradually shifted from a lived experience to a historical event, the number of claims and counterclaims about their music, their career, and the alleged significance of particular places has multiplied. One recent book claims that there is a chapter of the group's career that has been overlooked, the story of their Irish heritage and connections with Ireland. Another states that the Welsh connection provides a fascinating microcosm of the career of the group. Yet another sets out to prove that the Beatles loved Scotland and the evidence was all there. An account of their 1964 tour of Australia and New Zealand presents itself as a vital missing link in the unravelling of the most extraordinary social phenomenon of the century. But many of these are unashamed attempts to rewrite history, to see connections where none exist, to impose present judgments on past events, to privilege one set of explanations over others, to turn fleeting moments and chance locations into influential patterns of cause and effect. Very well said. And that brings me to the next book because I can accuse Alan Clayson, who wrote this one, of a lot of that. I think there's a lot of partisan um, cause and effect in this book. And I think he's got an axe to grind, in my opinion. The timeline of the book is all over the place. And I think it's that way um, in an effort to obscure the fact that it started with Liverpool. You know, the first significant band over there was Derry Wilkie and the Seniors, and they were followed immediately by the Beatles and Rolling Stone, and then that led to a lot more of the Liverpool bands. He tries to kind of cloak this by talking about some of the other bands first and everything, and the timeline's weird. Um, One of the better parts of the book is a chunk about Tony Sheridan, who was a massive influence. I won't talk too much more about Tony Sheridan because there is a biography of his which I will review. But I I think that Alan Clayson really resents the Beatles and in particular John. There's lots of digs about John in the book, and it colours the whole thing. And he tries to stack various things in the favour of this thesis. For example, he talks up a character in the book, a musician, Paul Raven, as being very significant and you know, really in ways that he's more significant than the Beatles. Paul Raven was Gary Glitter of paedophilia fame. He's a multiple convicted paedophile. So that really does leave a whole bad taste to the whole book. And another outrageous claim he makes is the band Dave D, Dozy, Beaky, Mick and Titch. Um, he says, he actually said in this, it's actually on the blurb, that they were more popular in Hamburg than the Beatles. Well, they were when the Beatles weren't there after 62. Obviously, when there is a scene, whoever's on that scene is the popular people, and the people who are not there anymore are not on that scene. And you could say the same about Liverpool. Once the Beatles left Liverpool, there were bands who in Liverpool were very popular at the time. Meanwhile, the Beatles were globally popular. And if you'd taken a poll of who you liked, the Beatles would come out top. Just think on Dave D, Dozy, etc. One of the band was once interviewed on Radio Merseyside, and he was asked, "Which one were you?" And he said, "I don't know." So that's that. Okay, the next book is this one, Beatles Hamburg, a tour guide to Beatles sites. Very useful. It's of particular use if you are going to go to Hamburg and have a look at the sites. It's very detailed. There's line maps of every site, every venue, and it's got things like the top 10 club. Um, this actually is out of date. That picture's not there now. That sign's not there now. It's called something else. Uh, it changes over the time. I found it useful on my last trip to Hamburg. I used it and I made a little video. And at some stage, I may put it up on the channel uh, just to show you. I went around all the sites that I could find. There was a couple I couldn't find, and they're not in the book. The Mambo Shanker, I couldn't find that. I went to the Hotel Pacific. Um, I had a coffee in there. Um, that's where the Beatles stayed while at the Star Club, and also the Bambino where they slept uh, during the first visit. And there's a plaque there. I photographed that. I'll put the picture here, and it's really good. I did when I reviewed the tour guide on my site. I did mention that a couple of the directions he gets right and left wrong, but you can work it out. I'd say I find it very, very useful. Maybe not so useful if you don't go to Hamburg. And another thing I would say is that, like Liverpool Council, Hamburg has woefully neglected the connection with the Beatles. There isn't that much really done. Um, I didn't see any organised tours. At one time, there was a museum. I think Ulf Kruger was involved in it, and they had lots of stuff. It was on the Reeperbahn, and it closed down. Lack of interest, I think. It was probably wasn't promoted particularly well. Uh, the thing is that all the Beatles, 99% of the Beatles memorabilia sites are around the Reeperbahn, which is a red light area, and which is a bit of an embarrassment to Hamburg, I think. Um, you know, they, St. Pauli, which is the area of the Reeperbahn, was always it was they were always outsiders. They were outside the law in a way, and it remains to this day. They were kind of beyond the pale. They did create, excuse me, create Beatles which is the junction of Grosse Freiheit and Reeperbahn, and there's some outline statues of the Beatles there, which are worth looking at. But apart from that, very, very little. And Liverpool, the city that uh, does not call the music festival Beatles Week anymore. They changed it to the International Music Festival. Yeah, I just despair of our council. Um, so I could go on for a long time about that. Okay, to sum up the books, I like this book a lot. Um, big problems with this book. It's it's got an agenda, and I found this very, very useful. And then um, going back to the original thing, the influence of Hamburg on the Beatles, and which was more important. And I think that's a really a question to be sidestepped because what they were both important places, and it, one wouldn't have existed without the other. Really, Hamburg was the place where the Beatles, as I say, became the tight, professional Max Shaw band. But then when they came back, Liverpool was the place that they got the work. At any one time, there was really only one venue open in Hamburg. You know, the Kaiser Keller uh, kind of became moribund once the top 10 opened, and the top 10 declined as soon as the Star Club opened. There was only really one place going at any one time. Liverpool had literally hundreds of venues at any one time. Very vibrant scene. And the bands that followed the Beatles to Hamburg from other cities were quite often influenced by Liverpool. They had seen what happened in Liverpool, and that's why they were playing that type of music. And so Liverpool, without a doubt, and the Cavern in particular, was so important. But Hamburg had its place, and these three books do reflect that.